The dust hadn't even settled on Thomas Kane's grave when the first suitor came calling, and Olivia Kane had slammed her farmhouse door so hard the hinges screamed in protest. That was in the spring of 1878, when Scottsbluff, Nebraska was still finding its legs as a proper town, and when a 24-year-old widow with 160 acres of good land was considered prime picking for any man with ambition. Olivia had loved her husband with a fierce devotion that surprised even herself, and his death from pneumonia that brutal winter had carved out something inside her chest that she wasn't sure would ever fill again. The thought of replacing Thomas, of letting some stranger sleep in the bed they'd shared, of pretending her heart wasn't still breaking every morning when she woke and reached for him in the darkness, made her stomach turn. The suitors came anyway. They came with flowers and promises, with offers to take care of her property and her future, with sympathetic eyes that looked past her grief and saw only opportunity. She turned them all away with the same cold politeness that her mother had taught her, until they stopped being polite, and she stopped bothering with courtesy at all. Lucas Shepard had been working the cattle drive routes for 6 years when he first rode into Scottsbluff that summer, bringing a herd up from Texas to the railhead. He was 26, tall and lean from years in the saddle, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that never quite stayed where he pushed it. His eyes were the color of creek water, that shifting green-brown that changed with his mood, and his hands were calloused from rope and leather and hard work. He wasn't looking for anything in Scottsbluff except a hot meal and a soft bed before heading back south, but then he'd seen her. Olivia Kane had been standing outside the general store, her arms full of flour sacks and her auburn hair escaping from its pins in the wind. She'd been arguing with a man twice her age, her green eyes flashing with anger as she told him in no uncertain terms that she didn't need his help, didn't want his attention, and would he please stop making a fool of himself in the middle of town. The man had sputtered and blustered, but eventually he'd backed down, and Olivia had loaded those flour sacks into her wagon by herself, her jaw set with determination. Lucas had watched the whole exchange from across the street, and something in his chest had shifted. He'd seen plenty of pretty women in his travels, had even courted a few when he was younger and more optimistic about settling down. But there was something about the way Olivia held herself, the strength in her movements and the sorrow in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, that made him want to know her story. He'd asked around town, the way travelers do, and heard all about the widow Kane who'd buried her husband and her heart in the same season. The stories painted her as either admirably devoted or stubbornly foolish, depending on who was telling them. The town's banker had tried courting her. The owner of the feed store had proposed marriage twice. Even the new schoolteacher, a soft-spoken man from Philadelphia, had been sent away with his dignity barely intact. Lucas had listened to it all and made a decision that most people would have called crazy. He wasn't going to court her. He wasn't going to show up at her door with flowers or press her with attention she clearly didn't want. He was just going to be there, patient and steady, until the day came when maybe she'd be ready to let someone in again. The first year, he took a job at the Parker Ranch just outside of town, working their cattle and breaking their horses. It was good work, honest work, and it kept him close to Scottsbluff without making a nuisance of himself. He saw Olivia in town sometimes, always from a distance. She'd come in for supplies or to conduct business at the bank, always alone, always with that same determined set to her shoulders. He never approached her, never even let on that he noticed her particularly, but he watched and he waited. The second year, he bought a small piece of land bordering her property. It wasn't much, just 40 acres with a creek running through it, but it was his and he worked it hard. He built a cabin, sturdy and simple, and started a small herd of his own. Sometimes he'd see Olivia riding the fence line of her property, checking for breaks or counting her cattle, and he'd tip his hat if she was close enough to see. She never waved back, but she stopped looking quite so suspicious when she spotted him. It was in the spring of his second year in Scottsbluff that he finally had an excuse to speak with her. A section of fence between their properties had come down in a storm, and several of her cattle had wandered onto his land. He found them grazing peacefully by his creek, and he spent the better part of a morning gently herding them back toward her property. Olivia had been out looking for them, riding a sturdy paint mare with obvious skill. She'd reined up when she saw Lucas driving her cattle back through the gap in the fence, and for a long moment they just looked at each other across the space between them. "Found these on my side," Lucas had called out, keeping his tone easy and friendly. "Figured they belonged to you." Olivia had ridden closer, her eyes scanning her cattle for injury or distress. "I appreciate it," she'd said, and her voice had been lower than he'd expected, husky and warm despite the coolness in her manner. "How much do I owe you for your trouble?" "Nothing," Lucas had said immediately. "Just being neighborly. Though I was planning to fix this fence section today if you want to split the materials." She'd studied him for a long moment, and he'd held her gaze without pushing, without expectation. Finally, she'd nodded. "That's fair. I'll bring my share of the wood this afternoon." She'd been true to her word. They'd worked together in a careful silence, Lucas on his side of the fence and Olivia on hers, passing tools when needed but keeping a respectful distance. When the work was done and the fence stood straight and strong again, Olivia had mounted her horse without a word of goodbye, but then she'd paused, looking back at him with something almost like curiosity in her eyes. "You're Lucas Shepherd," she'd said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, madam." "I've heard about you around town." He'd waited, not sure where this was going. "They say you're honest, hard-working." She'd paused. "They also say you're not looking for a wife." Lucas had smiled slightly at that. "I'm not looking to force myself on anyone who doesn't want me, that's for certain." Something had flickered in her expression then, too quick to read. "Good. I appreciate a man who minds his own business." She'd ridden off after that, and Lucas had watched her go with a strange mixture of patience and longing. It wasn't much, that first real conversation, but it was a start. Summer came hot and dry that year, and the creek that ran through Lucas's property became a valuable resource for both their herds. Olivia would bring her cattle down in the early mornings, before the heat of the day, and Lucas made sure to always be working somewhere else on his land when she did. He never wanted her to feel watched or pressured, never wanted her to think he was using the water access as leverage. It was Olivia who broke the pattern one morning in late July. Lucas had been replacing some boards on his cabin when he'd heard the sound of a horse approaching. He turned to see Olivia riding up, sitting straight in her saddle with a covered basket hanging from one arm. "Morning," she'd called out, and there had been something almost hesitant in her voice. Lucas had climbed down from his ladder, pulling off his work gloves. "Morning, Mrs. Kane." "Olivia," she'd said firmly. "I think we've been neighbors long enough for first names." "Olivia," he'd agreed, and he'd liked the way her name felt in his mouth. "Then you'd better call me Lucas." She'd nodded, and then she'd held out the basket. "I made extra bread this morning." Seemed foolish to let it go to waste when you're right next door. Lucas had taken the basket carefully, understanding the significance of the gesture. This was Olivia testing the waters, reaching out in a small way that didn't commit her to anything. "That's mighty kind of you. I appreciate it." "It's just bread," Olivia had said quickly, but there had been color in her cheeks. "Don't read anything into it." "Wouldn't dream of it," Lucas had assured her, and he'd meant it. But the bread had been the first crack in the wall Olivia had built around herself, and over the following months, those cracks had slowly widened. She'd started nodding to him when they passed each other in town. When his horse had thrown a shoe on her property, she'd invited him to use her barn and tools to fix it. When a cougar had been spotted in the area, they'd coordinated their efforts to protect their herds, riding patrol together in the evenings, and talking about everything except what they were both thinking about. Lucas learned that Olivia had grown up in Ohio, the daughter of a farmer who taught her everything he knew before dying when she was 16. She'd come west with Thomas, full of hope and dreams, and had spent 3 years building their farm into something profitable before pneumonia had stolen him away. She talked about Thomas sometimes, carefully, watching Lucas's face for judgment or jealousy. Lucas just listened, understanding that Thomas was part of Olivia's story, part of what made her who she was. Olivia learned that Lucas had been orphaned young, raised by an uncle who'd worked cattle drives and brought Lucas along as soon as he was big enough to sit a horse properly. He'd been drifting most of his adult life, never finding a place that felt like home until he'd come to Scottsbluff. He talked about the places he'd seen, the storms he'd weathered, the men he'd worked with, and the lessons he'd learned. He never talked about other women, and Olivia never asked, but she found herself grateful for his discretion. The 3rd year was when everything changed. It started with a drought that turned the prairie grass brown and made every water source precious. The creek on Lucas's property ran lower and lower, until by August it was barely more than a trickle. The river that fed Scottsbluff was still flowing, but it meant long drives to water the cattle, exhausting work in the brutal heat. Lucas had been bringing his small herd back from the river one afternoon when he'd spotted smoke rising from the direction of Olivia's property. His heart had kicked hard in his chest, and he'd left his cattle and spurred his horse into a gallop. Prairie fires were deadly, capable of wiping out everything in their path, and the drought had turned the entire landscape into kindling. When he'd reached Olivia's farm, he'd found her beating at the flames with a wet blanket, her face streaked with soot and her eyes wild with desperation. The fire had started in her hay barn, probably from a spark or a piece of glass catching the sun wrong, and it was spreading fast. Lucas had thrown himself into the fight without a word, grabbing another blanket and soaking it in the horse trough before joining her. They'd fought that fire for 3 hours, beating at the flames until their arms ached and their lungs burned from the smoke. Olivia's hay barn was lost, reduced to blackened timber and ash, but they'd managed to stop the fire from spreading to the rest of the farm. When it was finally over, when the last embers had been drowned and there was nothing left but exhaustion and relief, Olivia had collapsed right there in the dirt. Lucas had caught her before she hit the ground, and for the first time since he'd met her, he'd held her in his arms. She'd been trembling from exhaustion or fear or both, and he'd carried her to her farmhouse and set her carefully on the porch steps. He'd brought her water, made her drink, and checked her hands and arms for burns. "You saved my farm," Olivia had said finally, her voice hoarse from smoke. "If you hadn't come when you did, I would have lost everything." "You were holding your own," Lucas had said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "I just helped finish the job." Olivia had looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression had been different. Softer, open in a way he'd never seen before. "Why?" she'd asked. "Why did you come? Why do you stay here on this little patch of land doing all this work? You could go anywhere, do anything. Why stay here near me when I've made it clear I'm not interested in remarrying?" Lucas had considered his answer carefully, knowing this might be his only chance to be honest with her. "I'm not staying here waiting for you to marry me," he'd said slowly. I'm staying because this place feels like home for the first time in my life. Because I like the work and the land and the person I am when I'm here. And yes, because I care about you and I want to be around you even if that's all it ever is. You don't owe me anything, Olivia. You never have. She'd stared at him, her eyes searching his face for deception or manipulation. But Lucas had been telling the simple truth, and she must have seen it, because something in her had finally cracked wide open. I loved him, she'd whispered. I loved Thomas so much, and when he died, I thought I'd die too. I thought I'd never feel anything again except this hollow ache where my heart used to be. I know, Lucas had said gently. But lately, Olivia had continued, and her voice had been shaking now. Lately, I've started to feel things again. And it terrifies me, Lucas. It terrifies me because what if I let myself care about someone and I lose them too? What if I let myself be happy and it all gets taken away again? Lucas had reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away and taken her soot-stained hand in his. I can't promise I'll never die, he'd said. None of us can promise that, but I can promise that I'll do my best to stick around for a good long while, and I can promise that if you give me a chance, I'll never make you regret it. Olivia's eyes had filled with tears, the first Lucas had ever seen her shed. I don't know if I'm ready, she'd admitted. Then we'll wait until you are, Lucas had said simply. I'm a patient man, Olivia. I've got nowhere else I'd rather be. She'd cried then, really cried, and Lucas had held her hand through it all, steady and solid as the earth beneath them. When her tears had finally run dry, she'd looked at him with something like wonder in her eyes. You really mean that, don't you? You'd really just keep waiting with no guarantee of anything? Yes, Lucas had said, because it was the truth. Olivia had laughed then, a watery, exhausted sound. That might be the most romantic and the most frustrating thing anyone's ever said to me. I contain multitudes, Lucas had said with a slight smile, and Olivia had laughed again, more genuinely this time. They'd sat on that porch together until the sun set, not talking much, just being present with each other in a way they never had before. When Lucas had finally stood to leave, Olivia had caught his hand. Thank you, she'd said, for the help today, for everything. Any time, Lucas had replied, and he'd meant it. After that day, things between them shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Olivia started inviting Lucas over for supper once a week, cooking meals that reminded him of home even though he'd never really had one. They'd sit at her kitchen table and talk about their days, their plans, their hopes for the future. Olivia talked more about Thomas, and Lucas listened, understanding that she needed to share those memories with someone who wouldn't try to erase them. Lucas started teaching Olivia some of the tricks he'd learned about horse training, spending long afternoons in her corral, working with a young gelding she'd bought. They'd stand close together, Lucas's hand over hers on the lead rope, guiding her through the subtle communication between horse and handler. Olivia would lean into him sometimes, unconsciously seeking his warmth, and Lucas would steady her with a hand on her back. The town noticed, of course. Scottsbluff was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and the widow Kane's slowly warming relationship with Lucas Shepherd was prime gossip. Some people approved, saying it was about time Olivia moved on with her life. Others thought she was being disloyal to Thomas's memory. Lucas and Olivia ignored them all, moving at their own pace, building something real and lasting between them. It was October when Olivia finally admitted, out loud and directly, that she was falling in love with Lucas. They'd been riding together, checking the fence lines before winter set in, when Olivia's horse had spooked at a rattlesnake. Lucas had reacted instantly, grabbing her reins and getting both horses under control before anyone got hurt. In the aftermath, with adrenaline still pumping through her veins, Olivia had turned to Lucas with her heart in her eyes. "I love you," she'd said, and the words had been fierce, almost angry. "I didn't want to. I tried not to, but I love you, Lucas Shepherd, and I don't know what to do about it." Lucas had stared at her, something huge and warm blooming in his chest. "You don't have to do anything about it," he'd said. "Except maybe let me say it back. I love you too, Olivia. I've loved you since the day I saw you facing down that fool outside the general store. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you've survived things that would have broken other people. I love who you are, all of you, including the parts that still love Thomas." Olivia's eyes had filled with tears again. "It doesn't feel like a betrayal. Loving you while still loving him. Hearts are big enough for all kinds of love," Lucas had said. "You loving Thomas doesn't mean you can't love me too. And me loving you doesn't mean I want to erase what you had with him. That's part of your story, Olivia. I wouldn't want to change it even if I could." Olivia had urged her horse closer to his then until their legs were touching. "Kiss me," she'd said. "Please." Lucas had leaned across the space between them and kissed her softly, carefully, like she was something precious. Olivia had kissed him back with years of loneliness and longing, and when they'd finally pulled apart, they'd both been breathing hard. "I want to do this right," Olivia had said. "I want to court properly, have a real wedding, start fresh." "Whatever you want," Lucas had agreed. "I'm not going anywhere." They'd courted through that autumn and into winter, properly this time, with Lucas calling on Olivia at regular times, and Olivia accepting his invitations to town socials and church suppers. The town watched with interest as the widow Kane finally let someone past her defenses, and most people agreed that Lucas Shepherd was a good choice. He was respectful and hardworking, and he clearly adored Olivia without trying to control her or change her. Lucas proposed on Christmas Eve, in the parlor of Olivia's farmhouse with a simple gold ring that had belonged to his mother. Olivia said yes with tears streaming down her face, and they'd held each other for a long time, grateful for second chances and patient hearts. They were married in March of 1881, in the small church in Scottsbluff with half the town in attendance. Olivia wore a dress of deep blue rather than white, an acknowledgement that this was a second marriage, a new beginning rather than a first innocence. Lucas wore his best suit, his hair slicked back and his hands shaking slightly as he slipped the ring onto Olivia's finger. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Lucas had kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation had dabbed at their eyes. The wedding breakfast had been held at the hotel, with music and dancing and food enough for everyone. Olivia had danced with Lucas, her head on his shoulder and her heart full in a way she'd thought she'd never feel again. Lucas had held her close, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment, grateful for every patient day of waiting. That night, in the farmhouse that was now truly theirs together, Lucas had carried Olivia over the threshold and set her down gently in the bedroom they would share. They'd come together slowly, learning each other's bodies and rhythms, building something new between them that honored the past while embracing the future. Olivia had cried again, but these were tears of joy and release, and Lucas had kissed them away with infinite patience. Their first year of marriage was everything Lucas had hoped for and more. They worked their land together, combining their herds and their resources, building something stronger than either of them could have managed alone. Lucas expanded the farmhouse, adding on a larger kitchen and a second bedroom, thinking ahead to a future that might include children. Olivia threw herself into being a wife again, finding that the role fit differently this time but no less completely. They had their disagreements, of course. Olivia was stubborn and independent, used to making all her own decisions, and sometimes she forgot to consult Lucas before making major choices. Lucas was patient but not passive, and he insisted on being a real partner rather than just accepting whatever Olivia decided. They argued about money, about land management, about how many chickens they really needed, but they always talked it through, always found compromise, always went to bed on the same side. Their first child was born in February of 1882, a healthy boy they named Thomas after Olivia's first husband. Lucas had suggested the name without hesitation, understanding that honoring the past was important to Olivia. Little Thomas had his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and he was adored from the moment he drew his first breath. Olivia had been terrified during her pregnancy and labor, haunted by fears that something would go wrong, that she'd lose another person she loved. Lucas had been there through it all, holding her hand during the contractions, supporting her through the pushing, and weeping openly when their son was placed in his arms. In that moment, with his wife exhausted but glowing and his son squalling with healthy lungs, Lucas had felt more blessed than he'd ever thought possible. Little Thomas was followed by a daughter 2 years later, a tiny thing they named Clara, after Lucas's mother. She had Lucas's creek water eyes and Olivia's auburn hair, and she was just as stubborn as both her parents combined. The farmhouse rang with children's laughter, and Olivia found herself healing in ways she hadn't known she still needed. Lucas proved to be a devoted father, patient with childish questions, and willing to play endless games of pretend. He taught little Thomas to ride almost as soon as the boy could walk, and he carried Clara on his shoulders around the farm, pointing out birds and flowers and teaching her the names of everything. Olivia would watch them together, her heart full to bursting, amazed at the life she'd built from the ashes of her first marriage. The years rolled on, marked by the seasons and the slow growth of children. The farm prospered under their combined management, becoming one of the most productive in the area. Lucas's reputation as a horse trainer grew, and people came from neighboring counties to buy his stock or learn his methods. Olivia became known for her sharp business sense and her willingness to help other women who found themselves widowed or alone, offering advice and support born from her own experience. In 1886, Scottsbluff officially incorporated as a town, and Lucas was asked to serve on the first town council. He accepted, wanting to help shape the community that had become his home. Olivia supported him fully, taking on more of the farm work during council meetings and hosting gatherings at their home when needed. They'd become pillars of the community, respected and admired by their neighbors. Their third child came as something of a surprise in 1887. Olivia was 33 by then, and they'd thought their family was complete. But little Michael arrived in November, a healthy boy with a temperament as sunny as a summer day. Little Thomas, now 5, was thrilled to have a brother. Clara, 3 years old and fiercely independent, was less impressed, but eventually came around when she realized the baby couldn't steal her toys. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The children grew, the farm thrived, and Lucas and Olivia's love deepened with every passing year. They still took time for each other, still made sure to sit on the porch together after the children were asleep, talking about everything and nothing. Lucas would hold Olivia's hand, marveling at how rough and capable it was, marked by years of hard work. Olivia would lean against Lucas's shoulder, grateful for his steady presence, for the way he'd waited until her heart was ready. They talked sometimes about those early years, about all the men who tried to court Olivia before she was ready. Olivia would shake her head at the memory, amazed at her own stubbornness. Lucas would just smile, saying he'd never regretted a single day of waiting. The time it had taken for Olivia to heal, to be ready to love again, had been necessary. Rushing her would have broken something fragile and precious. Waiting had allowed them to build something real and lasting. As the 1880s drew to a close, Scottsbluff continued to grow and change. The railroad brought more people, more opportunities, more ways to connect to the wider world. But Lucas and Olivia's farm remained their anchor, the place where they'd built their life together. They expanded their holdings carefully, buying up neighboring properties as they became available, building something they could pass down to their children. Little Thomas showed early promise as a rancher, following his father around and absorbing everything he could about cattle and horses. Clara was proving to be sharp with numbers, helping her mother with the farm accounts and showing a head for business that impressed everyone. Michael was still too young to show his particular talents, but he was curious and eager, always asking questions and exploring everything he could reach. In 1890, Olivia received word that her sister in Ohio was ill. It was the first time she'd had any contact with her family back east since coming west with Thomas, and the news hit her hard. She wanted to go, wanted to see her sister one last time, but she was torn about leaving the farm and the children. Lucas had made the decision easy. "Go," he'd said firmly. "I can handle things here. Your sister needs you, and you'll regret it if you don't go." So Olivia had made the long journey east, taking the train across the country with a mixture of trepidation and hope. She'd been gone for 6 weeks, long enough to sit with her dying sister, to reconcile old family conflicts and to say proper goodbyes. It had been painful but necessary, and when she'd returned home to Nebraska, she'd felt lighter somehow, unburdened. Lucas had been waiting at the train station with all 3 children, and Olivia had run to them with tears streaming down her face. She'd held them all, breathing in the familiar scent of home, grateful beyond words for this second chance at family. That night, after the children were asleep, she'd made love to Lucas with fierce intensity, reaffirming their connection, celebrating life in the face of loss. As the 1890s progressed, their family continued to grow and change. Little Thomas, no longer so little at 10 years old, started taking on more responsibility around the farm. Clara, at 8, was reading everything she could get her hands on and talking about becoming a teacher someday. Michael, at 5, was the heart of the family, cheerful and affectionate, bringing light to even the hardest days. Lucas and Olivia grew older together, their bodies marked by years of hard work and their faces lined with laughter and tears. But they were happy, deeply and fundamentally happy in a way that felt like grace. They'd both survived loss and loneliness, and they'd found each other on the other side. Their love was seasoned and strong, built on patience and respect and genuine affection. In 1892, on their 11th wedding anniversary, Lucas had given Olivia a new ring, a delicate band with a small emerald that matched her eyes. "I know I already gave you a wedding ring," he'd said, slipping it onto her finger. "But I wanted to give you something that marked all these years we've had together. Every year has been a gift, Olivia. Every day with you has been exactly where I wanted to be." Olivia had cried naturally because Lucas still had the ability to move her to tears with his simple, sincere declarations of love. "You waited for me," she'd said, not for the first time. "When everyone else was trying to push me into something I wasn't ready for, you just waited." "Best decision I ever made," Lucas had replied, and he'd kissed her there in their bedroom, with the afternoon sun streaming through the windows and the sound of their children playing in the yard outside. They talked sometimes about what would have happened if Lucas hadn't been so patient, if he'd pushed or pressured or tried to force Olivia into something before she was ready. They both knew, without saying it directly, that it would have destroyed any chance they had. Olivia had needed time to grieve, to heal, to remember who she was outside of being Thomas's wife. And Lucas had needed to prove, through his actions rather than his words, that he was worth taking a chance on. The waiting had been hard sometimes. Lucas admitted that freely. There had been moments when he'd wondered if Olivia would ever be ready, if he was wasting his time hoping for something that would never happen. But he'd never regretted staying, never regretted building his life in Scottsbluff, even when there was no guarantee that Olivia would eventually come to love him. The life he'd built was worthwhile on its own, and Olivia's eventual love had been a blessing rather than an expectation. By 1895, Thomas was 13 and already taller than his mother. Clara was 11 and reading at a level that astonished her teachers, and Michael was 8 and showing signs of being a natural horseman like his father. The farm was thriving, the children were healthy, and Lucas and Olivia's marriage was as strong as the day they'd said their vows. They'd expanded beyond just cattle and horses by then, diversifying into crops and chickens, and even a small orchard that Olivia had planted and tended with love. The farm employed several workers during busy seasons, and Lucas and Olivia had earned reputations as fair and generous employers. They paid well, treated their workers with respect, and were known for helping out during times of trouble. The town of Scottsbluff had grown substantially since those early days when Lucas had first arrived. There was a proper school now, with 3 teachers. The main street boasted a dozen businesses. The railroad brought goods and people from all over the country, but some things hadn't changed. People still knew their neighbors. Folks still helped each other during hard times, and the land still demanded respect and hard work from everyone who tried to make a living from it. Lucas served 2 more terms on the town council, helping to guide Scottsbluff through its growing pains. Olivia became involved in the church auxiliary, organizing charity drives and supporting families in need. Together, they became the kind of couple that people pointed to as an example of what marriage could be, solid and loving and built on mutual respect. In the summer of 1896, a young widow moved to town with her 2 small children. She'd been left with almost nothing after her husband died in a mining accident, and she was struggling to figure out how to survive. Olivia had recognized something of herself in the woman's desperate determination, and she'd reached out immediately. "Give yourself time," Olivia had told her, sitting in the woman's tiny rented room while Lucas watched the children outside. "Everyone's going to have advice, and half of them will tell you that you need to remarry as soon as possible. But you don't have to listen to them. Take the time you need to grieve, to figure out who you are now. The right person will wait for you if they're meant to." The young widow had looked at her with grateful, exhausted eyes. "How long did you wait?" she'd asked. 3 years before I was even willing to consider it," Olivia had admitted. "And the man who's now my husband never pushed, never rushed me. He just lived his life near mine and waited until I was ready." "I don't know if I'll ever be ready," the widow had whispered. "You might not," Olivia had said honestly, "and that's okay too. But if you are someday, you'll know, your heart will tell you when it's healed enough to risk loving again." That conversation had stayed with Olivia for a long time. It reminded her of how far she'd come, how much she'd healed, how blessed she was to have found Lucas. That night, she'd held him extra tight, whispering her love and gratitude into the darkness of their bedroom. The turn of the century came and went, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. Scottsbluff celebrated with a big party, fireworks and dancing and speeches about the bright future ahead. Lucas and Olivia attended with their children, now 15, 13, and 10, old enough to stay up late and appreciate the significance of the moment. Standing in the town square with Lucas's arm around her waist and her children nearby, Olivia had felt a profound sense of peace. She'd survived losing her first love, had rebuilt her life from grief, had taken a chance on loving again despite her fears. And it had all been worth it. Every moment of pain, every year of loneliness, every fear she'd had to overcome had led her to this moment, surrounded by the family she'd built with Lucas. "What are you thinking about?" Lucas had murmured in her ear, pulling her closer. "Just how lucky I am," Olivia had replied. "How patient you were, how right everything turned out." Lucas had kissed her temple, not caring who saw. "We were both lucky," he'd said. "I found someone worth waiting for, and you found someone willing to wait. That's pretty rare." As the new century unfolded, the Shepherd family continued to thrive. Thomas took over more and more of the farm operations, showing a natural talent for ranching and business. Clara, true to her childhood dreams, became a teacher, working at the Scottsbluff school and loving every minute of it. Michael, blessed with his father's way with horses, started building a reputation as a trainer even while still a teenager. Lucas and Olivia gradually stepped back from the day-to-day running of the farm, though they never fully retired. They took more time for each other, taking long rides across their property, sitting on the porch in the evenings, traveling occasionally to visit other towns and see more of the country. They'd earned their rest, earned the right to enjoy the fruits of their decades of hard work. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1901, the whole family gathered for a celebration. Thomas brought his new wife, a sweet girl from town. Clara brought her students' latest essays to share, bursting with pride in their progress. Michael brought a new colt he'd been training, eager to show his father his technique. The farmhouse was full of noise and laughter and love, exactly as Lucas and Olivia had always hoped it would be. That evening, after everyone else had gone to bed, Lucas and Olivia sat on their porch as they'd done countless times before. The Nebraska sky was clear and full of stars, and the air was warm with the promise of summer. 20 years, Olivia said softly, lacing her fingers through Lucas's. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime. Sometimes it feels like no time at all." "Best 20 years of my life," Lucas said, and it was true. "Worth every day I waited before them." "Do you ever regret it?" Olivia asked. "Those years when you didn't know if I'd ever be ready." "When you were building your life alone, hoping but not knowing," Lucas considered the question seriously, as he always did when Olivia asked something important. "No," he said finally. "Even if you'd never been ready, even if we'd never gotten together, I wouldn't regret it. Those years taught me patience. They taught me that love isn't about possession or pressure. They taught me that the best things in life are worth waiting for." Olivia leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the strength of him, the steady warmth that had been there for her even before she'd been ready to accept it. "I regret making you wait," she admitted. "I regret all that time we could have had together." "Don't," Lucas said firmly, turning to face her. "That time was necessary, Olivia. You needed to heal. You needed to grieve Thomas properly. If we'd gotten together before you were ready, before you'd worked through all that pain, it would have poisoned what we have now. The waiting wasn't wasted time. It was preparation time." Olivia's eyes filled with tears, as they still did when Lucas said something particularly moving. "How did you get so wise?" "Years of practice," Lucas said with a slight smile, "and a very good teacher. You taught me more about strength and resilience than I ever learned from any cowboy or cattle drive." They kissed then, soft and sweet, a kiss that spoke of 20 years of marriage and all the years still to come. They'd built something real and lasting, something that honored the past while embracing the future. Their love story wasn't simple or easy, but it was true, and that made it beautiful. As they sat together under the stars, Lucas thought about all those men who tried to court Olivia in those early years, who'd seen her as an opportunity or a prize to be won. They'd all been so focused on getting what they wanted that they'd never stopped to think about what Olivia needed. They'd pushed and pressured and tried to force her into something she wasn't ready for, and they'd all been sent away. Lucas had taken a different approach. He'd built his own life, pursued his own dreams, and simply made space for Olivia in his world without demanding anything in return. He'd shown up consistently, worked hard, been a good neighbor and friend, and waited. Not in a passive way, not sitting around hoping something would happen, but actively living a life that was fulfilling on its own while remaining open to the possibility of love. And Olivia, for her part, had honored her own healing process. She hadn't let others rush her or shame her into moving on before she was ready. She'd taken the time she needed to grieve, to remember, to rebuild her sense of self. And when she'd finally been ready to risk loving again, she'd chosen someone who'd proven through his patience and consistency that he was worthy of her trust. Their story had become something of a legend in Scottsbluff, told to young people as an example of how love should work. The widow who'd refused all suitors for years. The cowboy who'd simply waited until her heart was ready. It sounded like a fairy tale when people told it, but Lucas and Olivia knew the truth was more complex and more beautiful than any simple story could capture. The years continued to pass, marked by the usual milestones of life. Grandchildren arrived, first from Thomas and then eventually from Clara and Michael as well. The farmhouse saw another generation of children running through its halls, and Lucas and Olivia embraced their roles as grandparents with joy. They told their grandchildren stories about the old days, about cattle drives and drought and the fire that had almost destroyed everything. They told them about patience and love and the importance of waiting for the right person. In 1908, as Lucas turned 56 and Olivia turned 54, they made a decision to officially turn the farm over to Thomas and his family. It was time, they both agreed, to step back completely and let the next generation take over. They kept the original cabin that Lucas had built, the little 40 acres where everything had started, and they moved there to live out their remaining years. It felt right, coming back to the beginning. This was where Lucas had first decided to stay in Scottsbluff, where he'd built his first home, where he'd waited patiently for Olivia to be ready. The cabin had been expanded and improved over the years, but it still held the bones of that original structure, still carried the memory of those early days. They filled their days with simple pleasures. Lucas trained horses for people who sought him out, working at his own pace with no pressure or deadlines. Olivia tended a large garden and taught her granddaughters to can and preserve. They rode together in the evenings, went for long walks around their property, visited with their children and grandchildren, and enjoyed the life they'd built together. On a warm evening in June of 1910, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Olivia turned to Lucas with a serious expression. "I want you to know something," she said, taking his weathered hand in hers. "I want you to know that I don't think of you as my second husband. I know technically that's what you are, but it's not how I think of you." Lucas waited, curious where this was going. "Thomas was my first love," Olivia continued, "and I'll always be grateful for the years we had together. But you, Lucas, you're the love of my life. You're the person I was meant to build a future with. You're the one who taught me that hearts can heal and love can grow even after devastating loss. I just wanted you to know that." Lucas felt something tight in his chest, a surge of emotion that threatened to overflow. "Olivia," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "that might be the most beautiful thing anyone's ever said to me, but I need you to know something too. I never felt like I was competing with Thomas. I never felt like a second choice. You chose me when you were ready, with full knowledge of what you wanted and needed. That makes me the luckiest man alive." They held each other as the sun set over the Nebraska prairie. Two people who'd found each other against the odds, who'd built a life together through patience and persistence and profound love. Their story wasn't simple, but it was real, and that made it perfect. As they grew older, their love only deepened. They developed the comfortable intimacy of couples who'd spent decades together, able to communicate with a glance or a touch. They knew each other's habits and preferences, knew when to offer comfort and when to give space, knew how to support each other through life's inevitable challenges. In 1912, Lucas took ill with pneumonia, the same disease that had killed Thomas Kane so many years before. Olivia nursed him through it with fierce determination, refusing to lose another husband to the same illness. She barely slept for 2 weeks, sitting by his bedside, forcing fluids and medicine down his throat, praying harder than she'd ever prayed in her life. Lucas survived, weakened but alive, and Olivia had cried with relief when he finally turned the corner. Lucas had held her, understanding her fear, grateful for her care. "I'm not going anywhere," he'd promised her. "I've got too much to stick around for," and he kept that promise. They had more years together, precious years filled with family and love, and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. They saw their grandchildren grow, celebrated marriages and births, weathered the occasional tragedy together. They grew old side by side, their hair turning silver, their bodies slowing down, but their love remaining constant. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1911, they renewed their vows in the same church where they'd been married. All their children and grandchildren attended, along with much of the town of Scottsbluff. It was a celebration not just of their marriage, but of the values they represented: patience, perseverance, respect, and enduring love. "I, Lucas, take you, Olivia, to be my wife," Lucas had said, his voice strong despite his age. "Again and always. For all the years we've had and all the years we have left, you've made my life complete in ways I never imagined possible. I, Olivia, take you, Lucas, to be my husband," Olivia had replied, her eyes shining with tears. "For waiting when I needed time, for loving me when I was ready, for building this beautiful life with me. I choose you today as I chose you 30 years ago with my whole heart." There wasn't a dry eye in the church. As the years rolled into the 1910s, Lucas and Olivia settled into a peaceful old age. They weren't as active as they'd once been, but they were content. They spent their days tending their small garden, playing with their great-grandchildren when they visited, and enjoying each other's company. They talked about everything and nothing, revisited old memories, and made new ones every day. On a spring morning in 1915, as they sat on their porch drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over their land, Olivia turned to Lucas with a smile. "You remember the day we met?" she asked. "Really met, I mean, not just you watching me from across the street." "The day your cattle came through the fence," Lucas said immediately. "You were so suspicious of me, thought I was trying to manipulate you somehow." Olivia laughed. "Can you blame me? I'd had so many men trying to trick me into marrying them, I didn't trust anyone." "And yet here we are," Lucas said, reaching for her hand. 34 years later, married for 34 of those years, with children and grandchildren and a whole life we've built together. "Because you waited," Olivia said softly. "Because you didn't push or pressure or try to force me into anything before I was ready. You just lived your life and let me live mine until the day came when we could live them together." "Best decision I ever made," Lucas said, as he'd said so many times before. They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, watching the world wake up around them. After so many years together, they didn't always need words. The silence between them was full of understanding and love. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the prairie, Olivia thought about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about Thomas, her first love, and how devastated she'd been when he died. She thought about those hard years of grief, when everyone had been telling her to move on but her heart had been too broken to even consider it. She thought about all those suitors she'd refused, unable to imagine replacing what she'd lost. And then she thought about Lucas, patient Lucas, who'd seen her for who she was and had been content to wait until she was ready to be seen. He'd built his own life, pursued his own dreams, but he'd always been there, steady as the earth, waiting without expectation or demand. He'd given her the gift of time, the space to heal, the freedom to come to love again on her own terms. "Thank you," Olivia said suddenly, surprising herself. Lucas looked at her curiously. "For what?" "For understanding what I needed even when I didn't understand it myself," Olivia said. "For not rushing me. For building a life that included me but didn't depend on me. For being patient enough to wait for my heart to be ready." Lucas smiled, that slow, warm smile that still made Olivia's heart flutter even after all these years. "You were worth waiting for," he said simply. "You've always been worth waiting for." As they sat together in the morning sun, surrounded by the life they'd built together, Lucas and Olivia felt the profound satisfaction of a story well told. They'd both survived loss and loneliness, had both taken the long road to finding each other, but they'd made it. They'd built something real and lasting, something that would endure in the memories of their children and grandchildren long after they were gone. Their story would be told in Scottsbluff for generations. The widow who refused all suitors for years, and the cowboy who simply waited until her heart was ready. It was a story about patience and respect, about giving people the time they need to heal, about understanding that love can't be rushed or forced. It was a story about second chances and the courage it takes to risk loving again after devastating loss. But more than anything, it was a love story. A real, messy, beautiful love story about two people who found each other at exactly the right time, not a moment sooner or later than when they were both ready. And that, Lucas and Olivia both agreed, was the best kind of love story there was. As the years continued to flow forward, bringing new challenges and joys, Lucas and Olivia faced them together, hand in hand, heart to heart. They grew old gracefully, their love maturing like fine wine, becoming richer and deeper with each passing year. They had their share of health scares and difficulties, as all elderly people do, but they navigated them together, drawing strength from their bond. In 1918, when the Spanish flu swept through Nebraska, claiming lives throughout the state, Lucas and Olivia sheltered at their cabin, avoiding town and limiting contact with others. They were fortunate enough to escape the illness, though they grieved for neighbors and friends who weren't so lucky. The pandemic reminded them of their mortality, of how precious every day together was, and they held each other a little tighter in the aftermath. Their children checked on them regularly, bringing supplies and news from town. Thomas, now a successful rancher in his own right, made sure his parents wanted for nothing. Clara, beloved by her students and respected in the community, visited whenever she could, bringing her own children to spend time with their grandparents. Michael, who'd taken over Lucas's horse training business and expanded it impressively, came by almost daily, often bringing young horses for Lucas to observe and offer advice on. The family that Lucas and Olivia had created together had grown and flourished beyond their wildest dreams. There were dozens of descendants now, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all carrying forward the values that Lucas and Olivia had tried to instill. Hard work, integrity, patience, and love. As Lucas approached 70 years old in 1920, he was still sharp and active, though he'd slowed down considerably. His hands were gnarled with arthritis, his hair was pure white, and he moved more carefully than he once had. But his mind was clear, his heart was strong, and his love for Olivia was as fierce as ever. Olivia, at 66, had aged gracefully. Her auburn hair had turned silver but was still thick and lustrous. Her green eyes still sparkled with intelligence and warmth. She'd developed a slight limp from an old injury, but it didn't slow her down much. She still tended her garden, still cooked for her family when they visited, still read voraciously and kept up with current events. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1921 with a large party at the main farmhouse, surrounded by family and friends. The whole town seemed to turn out, wanting to honor the couple who'd become living legends in Scottsbluff. There were speeches and toasts, music and dancing, and enough food to feed an army. Lucas and Olivia sat together at the head table, overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and affection. They held hands throughout the celebration, occasionally sharing a private smile or a whispered comment. They were the center of attention, but they only really saw each other. When it came time to cut the anniversary cake, Lucas stood with some effort and raised his glass. The crowd quieted, waiting to hear what he would say. "I'm not much for speeches," Lucas began, his voice still strong despite his age. "Most of you know I'm a man of action more than words. But on this day, celebrating 40 years of marriage to the most remarkable woman I've ever known, I feel like I need to say something." He looked down at Olivia, and the love in his eyes was unmistakable. 40 years ago, I married a widow who'd made it clear she wasn't interested in replacing her late husband. She'd turned away every suitor who tried to court her, and she had every intention of staying alone. But I was stubborn, and I was patient, and I believed that if I just waited, if I just showed her through my actions that I was worth taking a chance on, she might eventually give me a shot. The crowd laughed softly, many of them knowing the story well. "It took 3 years from the day I met her to the day she finally admitted she loved me," Lucas continued. 3 years of living nearby, working my land, being her neighbor and friend, and waiting for her heart to be ready. Some people told me I was wasting my time. Others said I should move on, find someone easier. But I knew, deep in my bones, that Olivia was worth waiting for. He reached down and took Olivia's hand, helping her stand beside him. And I was right. These 40 years have been the greatest gift of my life. Olivia has made me a better man. She's given me a family I never dreamed I'd have. She's been my partner, my best friend, my love, and my home. Every day I waited was worth it for every day I've had with her since. Olivia was crying openly now, and she wasn't the only one. Half the room was dabbing at their eyes. "So here's what I want all of you to remember," Lucas said, his voice strong and clear. "Love is patient. Real love doesn't demand or pressure or force. Real love waits until both people are ready, until both hearts are open, until the timing is right. If I'd pushed Olivia before she was ready, I would have lost her forever. By waiting, by being patient, I gained everything." He turned to Olivia, cupping her face gently in his weathered hands. "Thank you," he said softly, just for her. "Thank you for eventually being ready. Thank you for taking a chance on me. Thank you for 40 years of love." Olivia kissed him then, right there in front of everyone, a kiss that spoke of decades of love and countless tomorrows yet to come. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, celebrating not just an anniversary but a love story that had inspired them all. As the party continued around them, Lucas and Olivia found a quiet corner to sit together, watching their family and friends celebrate. They were tired but happy, grateful for every moment they'd been given. "You think we made a difference?" Olivia asked softly. "Do you think our story matters to anyone besides us?" Lucas considered the question, watching as one of their grandsons helped his new bride onto the dance floor, their love fresh and shining. "I think we showed people that patience is valuable," he said. "That waiting for the right time is sometimes more important than rushing forward. That respecting someone's grief and giving them space to heal is the greatest gift you can offer." "I hope so," Olivia said. "I'd hate to think all that pain, all those years of grief and loneliness were for nothing." "They weren't," Lucas assured her. "They made us who we are. They taught us what we value, and they brought us to each other at exactly the right moment." Olivia leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the familiar comfort that had been there for decades now. "I love you," she said simply. "More today than yesterday, more yesterday than the day before." "And I love you," Lucas replied, kissing the top of her head. "Always have, always will." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped up in each other, surrounded by the fruits of their patient love. The party swirled around them, full of laughter and joy, but they were in their own world, their own private moment of reflection and gratitude. As the sun set over Scottsbluff that evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Lucas and Olivia made their way slowly back to their cabin. They were exhausted but content, full of food and love and the satisfaction of a celebration well enjoyed. They prepared for bed in the comfortable silence of long marriage, moving around each other with practiced ease. That night, lying in bed with Olivia curled against his side, Lucas thought about the long journey that had brought him here. From orphaned boy to wandering cowboy to patient suitor to devoted husband and father. Every step had led him to this moment, to this woman, to this life. And he wouldn't change a single thing. "Lucas," Olivia murmured sleepily. "Yes, love, promise me something, anything. Promise me that when we're gone, when our story becomes just a tale people tell, they'll remember the important part, not just that you waited, but why you waited. Because you respected me enough to let me heal in my own time. Because you understood that real love can't be forced or rushed. That's what I want people to remember." Lucas tightened his arm around her, holding her close. "I promise," he said. "Though I think anyone who hears our story will understand that. You don't wait 3 years for someone unless you truly love them, and you don't take a chance on love again unless the person is worth the risk." Satisfied, Olivia drifted off to sleep, safe and warm in Lucas's embrace. Lucas stayed awake a little longer, listening to the familiar sounds of the prairie night, feeling profoundly grateful for the life he'd lived and the woman he'd been blessed to share it with. The years that followed were gentle ones. Lucas and Olivia grew more fragile as age advanced, but they remained devoted to each other and engaged with their family. They saw great-great-grandchildren born, watched the world change in ways they'd never imagined, and held onto each other through it all. In 1925, Lucas celebrated his 75th birthday surrounded by his enormous extended family. There were over 50 people crammed into and around the cabin, 3 generations of descendants all there to honor the patriarch of their family. Lucas was overwhelmed and touched, hardly able to believe that this sprawling, loving family had come from his union with Olivia. Olivia, now 71, organized the whole celebration with the help of her daughters and daughters-in-law. She might have been old, but she was still sharp as a tack, still capable of marshaling troops and making sure everything ran smoothly. She watched Lucas interact with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, saw the love and respect in their eyes, and felt a deep sense of accomplishment. They'd done it. They'd built something lasting, something that would continue long after they were gone. Their patient love had created a legacy that would endure for generations. As the 1920s rolled toward their conclusion, bringing with them all the changes of the modern age, Lucas and Olivia remained anchored in the life they'd built together. The world might be changing rapidly around them, but their love was constant, unchanging, eternal. They knew they were approaching the end of their journey together. They could feel it in their aging bodies, in the way they tired more easily, in the increasing difficulty of everyday tasks. But they faced it together without fear, knowing that they'd lived fully and loved completely. On a warm summer evening in 1928, as they sat on their beloved porch watching another Nebraska sunset, Olivia turned to Lucas with a peaceful smile. "We did good, didn't we?" she said. "We did great," Lucas corrected gently. "We built a life worth living, raised good children, and loved each other well. What more could anyone ask for?" "Nothing," Olivia agreed. "Nothing at all." They sat in companionable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant colors. They'd sat like this thousands of times over the years, and they never tired of it. This was their favorite time of day, when the work was done and they could just be together, appreciating the simple gift of each other's presence. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been so patient?" Olivia asked, a question she'd asked before but never tired of exploring. "Sometimes," Lucas admitted. "I imagine I would have ended up somewhere else, probably still drifting, never finding a real home. You needed time to heal, and I needed to learn what real love looks like. We both needed those years apart to become the people we needed to be for each other." "It all worked out exactly as it was meant to," Olivia said with certainty. "Every painful moment, every year of loneliness, every fear and doubt, they all led us here. To this porch, to this life, to each other, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." "Neither would I," Lucas said fervently. "Not one single moment." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Lucas and Olivia remained on their porch, holding hands and counting their blessings. They had their health, such as it was at their advanced age. They had a family who loved them. They had a community that respected them. And most importantly, they had each other, still devoted and deeply in love after nearly 50 years of marriage. Their story, the widow who refused all suitors and the cowboy who simply waited, had become legend in Scottsbluff and the surrounding areas. Young couples looked to them as an example of what love should be. Widows and widowers drew strength from Olivia's journey of healing and eventual readiness to love again. Men learned from Lucas's patient example that true love means respecting boundaries and giving people the time and space they need. As Lucas and Olivia entered their 80s, their days became quieter but no less meaningful. They moved slowly, napped frequently, and spent long hours simply sitting together, communicating more through touch and presence than words. Their minds remained sharp even as their bodies weakened, and they treasured every moment they had left together. On a crisp autumn morning in 1930, Olivia woke to find Lucas already awake beside her, watching her with tender eyes. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, as he'd said nearly every morning for almost 50 years. "Good morning, my love," Olivia replied, reaching for his hand. "What are you thinking about?" "About how lucky I am," Lucas said. "About how all those years of waiting brought me to you. About how every single day with you has been a gift I never took for granted." Olivia's eyes filled with tears, as they still did when Lucas said something particularly moving. "You know what I realized," she said. "All those suitors who tried to court me in those early years, they wanted me for what I could provide. My land, my labor, a ready-made home. But you, Lucas, you built your own life and only wanted me for me. That's why I eventually said yes. That's why I took the risk of loving again." You were never a risk, Lucas said firmly. You were a certainty. I knew from the moment I saw you that if I was patient enough, if I was steady enough, if I showed you through my actions who I really was, you might eventually give me a chance. And you did, and it's been the greatest honor of my life. They lay there together in their bed, the morning sun streaming through the windows, holding hands and remembering all the years they'd shared. The joys and sorrows, the triumphs and struggles, the ordinary moments that had made up their extraordinary love story. That evening, surrounded by their children and many of their grandchildren, Lucas and Olivia sat together at a family dinner. The table was laden with food, the room was full of laughter and conversation, and the love was almost tangible. This was what they'd built together, a family rooted in love, respect, and patience. As Lucas looked around the table at all these faces, all these descendants who carried his and Olivia's legacy forward, he felt a profound sense of completion. He'd lived a good life, a full life, a life worth living, and it had all started with a decision to wait, to be patient, to respect one woman's need to heal before she could love again. To Lucas and Olivia, Thomas called out, raising his glass, for showing all of us what real love looks like, for teaching us patience and perseverance, for building a family and a legacy that will endure for generations. To Lucas and Olivia, the whole family echoed, raising their glasses. Lucas and Olivia raised their glasses to each other, their eyes meeting across the table with a look that communicated decades of shared experience. They drank to each other, to their love, to the life they'd built together through patience and faith and unwavering devotion. As the years continued to pass, Lucas and Olivia faced their mortality with grace and courage. They'd both lived long, full lives, and while neither was eager to leave the other, they were at peace with whatever came next. They'd loved deeply, lived fully, and created something beautiful together. That was enough. On a quiet spring morning in 1931, nearly 50 years after their wedding day, Lucas woke early and watched the sunrise from his bedroom window. Olivia was still sleeping peacefully beside him, her silver hair spread across the pillow, her face relaxed and peaceful. Lucas watched her for a long moment, memorizing every detail, grateful beyond words for every day they'd been given together. When Olivia woke, she found Lucas sitting beside her, holding her hand gently. "I love you," Lucas said simply. "I've loved you since the day I first saw you, and I'll love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Olivia replied, squeezing his hand. "Thank you for waiting for me, Lucas. Thank you for understanding what I needed even when I didn't understand it myself. Thank you for being patient when everyone else was telling you to give up. You saved me, you know, not from being alone, but from believing I could never love again." "You saved me too," Lucas said. "You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You taught me what it means to really love someone, not just the easy parts, but all of it. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." Olivia Kane, shepherd. They spent that day together, just the two of them, reminiscing about their years together and talking about the future they'd helped create. They looked through old photographs, read letters they'd saved, and simply enjoyed being in each other's presence. As the sun set that evening, they sat on their porch one last time, holding hands and watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. The Nebraska prairie stretched out before them, beautiful and eternal, the land they'd worked and loved for so many years. "It was all worth it," Olivia said softly. "Every moment of pain, every year of waiting, every fear I had to overcome, it was all worth it to have this life with you." "Yes," Lucas agreed. "It was worth everything." They sat in peaceful silence as the stars emerged one by one, comfortable with each other and with the life they'd lived. They'd done what they set out to do: build a life together, raise a family, love each other completely. Their story, from their patient beginnings to this peaceful evening, was complete. Lucas and Olivia Shepherd lived several more peaceful years, surrounded by family and friends, honored and loved by their community. They passed away within months of each other in 1933, both in their early 80s, having lived full and satisfying lives. Their legacy lived on through their descendants, dozens of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward the values Lucas and Olivia had embodied: patience, respect, hard work, and enduring love. The Shepherd farm, started with Lucas's 40 acres and Olivia's 160, continued to thrive under the management of their descendants, a lasting testament to what they'd built together. But more than the land or the family, Lucas and Olivia's greatest legacy was their love story itself. It became a touchstone in Scottsbluff, a reminder that real love can't be rushed or forced, that patience is a virtue worth cultivating, and that giving people the time they need to heal is the greatest gift one person can offer another. The widow who refused all suitors for years, and the cowboy who simply waited until her heart was ready. It was a story of loss and healing, of patience and faith, of two people finding each other at exactly the right moment. It was a story that would be told for generations, inspiring others to be patient, to be understanding, to recognize that the best things in life are worth waiting for. And in the end, that's exactly what it had been: a love story for the ages, built on the foundation of patience and blooming into something beautiful and eternal. Lucas and Olivia had shown everyone who knew them that true love doesn't demand or pressure or force. It simply waits, steady and patient, until both hearts are ready to embrace it fully. Their story ended as all good love stories do, with two people who'd found each other against the odds, loved each other completely, and built something lasting together. They'd lived well, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And really, what more could anyone ask for from a life well lived?